All right, Texas in the Civil War. Of course, last semester we spent bringing Texas into statehood. We saw how the Spanish had claimed Texas, and the Indians had, after the Indians had been in what we now know as Texas for thousands of years, the Spanish arrived, and the Spanish don't do much with Texas until the French arrive. Then the Spanish start building a lot of missions until the French leave, and then they close. The Spanish close most of the missions. Eventually, of course, the Mexican people overthrow the Spanish and proclaim the state of Mexico, which included Texas. Of course, we saw that during this time period that Moses Austin and then his son Stephen F. Austin had that plan to bring Anglo families into Texas. And during the Mexican period, that plan was successful, and the Texas population grew, especially with Anglos. Those Anglos were happy and wanted to be a Mexican state. Then came Santa Anna, who basically is not a federalist, but a centralist who wants to be a dictator. And many different areas in Mexico rebelled, including Texas. Of course, Texas is the only successful area of that rebellion. We saw how Santa Anna brought his army into Texas, won the Battle of the Alamo and just killed those people, and committed the massacre at Goliad. And eventually Santa Anna's army was attacked and defeated by Sam Houston's Texian army at the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836. That brought about the Republic of Texas. The Republic of Texas was its own independent country for 9+ years. During that time, Texas was being rebuilt, and many different immigrant groups were coming to Texas. Also during this time, Houston and others were trying to bring Texas into the United States, and they were successful. Texas becomes part of the United States by 1845. Then we saw how the state of Texas was organized, how other immigrant groups started to arrive and build Texas, how the Texas system was based on agriculture. And now we come to a time, of course, of Civil War, where Texas will break away from the United States, which it had joined about 15 years earlier. Of course, that Civil War in Texas was not something that occurred only in Texas. There were many issues between the northern area of the United States and the southern area of the United States, which we will get into in United States history. Of course, slavery was a major issue of the Civil War. In the North, many abolitionists wanted to end slavery, or at least keep slavery contained only in the South. Meanwhile, slavery was a very important part of the Southern economy, and Southerners feared that if they released the slaves, their economy would basically be destroyed. There were other ideas associated with the Civil War as well. Northerners generally supported a higher tax on things coming in the country called tariff. Southerners generally supported a lower tariff. Both states actually believed in what they call states' rights, as we'll learn in U.S. history. The United States is a federal system where the states have power and the national government has power. Both North and South proclaimed states' rights at different times. but Southerners believed it was their right, a state's rights, to continue to have slavery or not. Well, of course, many northern states disagreed with that. And another issue, secession, that is, once you join the United States, do you have to stay or can you leave if you wish? And of course, many Northerners believed that secession, leaving the United States, was not legal or available in the Constitution, while many Southerners believed it was legal and available under the Constitution. So there's many issues being brought into focus in and around the year 1860. And those issues will lead to the Civil War, although of course slavery is the major issue.
Good afternoon, West Wildcatters. I am opening our faculty team to just share a brief meeting with us as we prepare to wrap up for the day. I will start shortly. Thank you.
So the Democratic Party, both in the United States and Texas, believed that it was the state's rights to leave the United States if the citizens of that state voted to do that, called secession. Of course, they also believed that it was the right of the state to have slavery or not to have slavery. Meanwhile, the newly formed Republican Party wanted to stop the spread of slavery. They were agreeable to allow slavery to be contained where it was, but did not want to see it spread to any other territories that might become states in the United States. Unfortunately for Southerners, as we'll see in American history, this is a big drawback because the cotton industry, which is their major moneymaker, basically needed more and more land to be economically viable, to keep making money. They need more and more land to plant more and more cotton. And if slavery was contained, that means the amount of cotton growing land available to them would simply stay the same, which means over time they'd have less and less cotton, which means that they'd have less and less money. So then we have the presidential election of 1860. When it comes time to have a candidate, the Democratic Party actually splits over the issue of slavery. Stephen Douglas basically was seen as sort of weak on slavery, so many southern states sort of put a southern Democratic candidate in the running, John C. Breckinridge, while many northern Democratic states Democratic voters chose Stephen Douglas to be the presidential candidate. And then, of course, with there was actually what we call a third political party at the time between the Republican and Democrat called the Constitutional Union Party. And basically their motto was, can't we all just get along? And apparently the answer was no. And of course their only goal was basically to keep the Union together. And their candidate was John Bell, although Sam Houston, the leader of the Texas Revolution and president of the Republic of Texas, he was almost the candidate for the Constitutional Union Party. Meanwhile, the Republican Party was putting Abraham Lincoln up for re-election, or up for election for president. So Lincoln becomes elected president, and when he is elected president, southern states who had threatened to secede if he won went ahead with their threats. South Carolina became the first state to formally secede, or at least they said they seceded from the Union. And shortly after, 5 other states followed. And once they seceded, they formed their own country, at least they said they formed their own country, called the Confederate States of America, sometimes just called the Confederacy. So the Confederacy would be headed by Jefferson Davis, and of course, at this point, basically everyone is going to have to make a decision on on many things. Of course, if you're one of the southern states, you have to make a decision on whether you want your state to leave and the United States and join the Confederacy, or whether you want your state to stay in the Confederacy. If your state leaves and joins the Confederacy, you as a Southerner have to decide whether you want to stay in that state and fight for the Confederacy, or go north and fight for the Union. If you're a Northerner, you have to decide, whether you want to let the Southerners leave in peace, or whether you want to fight to keep them in the United States. And if you want to keep them in, you have to decide whether you want to join the Union Army to fight or not. So many people are making decisions. So in reaction to Lincoln's election in Texas, a special convention was called. The Texas legislature was not in session. A special convention was called of Texas leaders, and they voted to secede or leave the United States by a vote of 166 to 8. However, Sam Houston, who had just been elected governor in 1859, just a year before, was a Unionist. He did not necessarily agree with the Republicans, but he felt that it was unconstitutional from the United States Constitution and the Texas Constitution to leave the United States. So he was called a Unionist, which means he wanted to stay with the Union. Now, as governor, as Texas voted to leave the United States, the convention asked all public officials, like mayors of towns and all the way up to the governor, to take an oath of allegiance to the Confederacy. That is, not only was Texas going to leave the United States, but it was going to join the Confederacy. Sam Houston refused. First of all, Sam Houston said that this convention had really no legal authority to secede from the United States. But even if it had the right to secede, that Texas would become, its own republic again. It would become its own nation again. That it had no legal right to join the Confederacy. So when Houston was asked to take the oath, he refused. He refused several times. And at that point, the convention voted him out as governor and voted a guy named Francis Lubbock as the new governor. Houston was offered by telegraph, Abraham Lincoln telegraphed Sam Houston, Union troops to fight to keep his governorship in Texas. But Houston, of course, being first and foremost a Texan, did not want to see Texan blood shed. That is, he was not going to shed Texas blood because he had fought for Texas. So Houston retired from the governorship, and he would go to live on his estate, and just a couple years later, in 1863, he would die. His son, Sam Houston Jr., would actually join the Confederacy and fight and be badly wounded at the Battle of Shiloh. But in 1863, Sam Houston died 70 years of age of ill health. Meanwhile, as Texas left the United States, the Union commander in Texas, the guy that was in charge of a fort at San Antonio, basically surrendered his fort to the Confederacy without firing a shot, on the agreement that he and his men could leave Texas. So the Union general in Texas surrendered and basically left the fort and left 10,000 sort of modern rifles there for Texans to use in the Confederacy. And those soldiers then were shipped off by ship from Galveston, and they went back north and eventually would, of course, be part of the Union Army that would fight against the South. Okay. So on March 2nd, 1861, Texas became the 7th state to secede or leave the United States. So here's sort of the vote that was against the Confederacy. So the darker the color, that means more people voted to stay in the Union, to stay in the United States and not to leave. Basically, in the very blackish areas, those like over 70% of those people in that county decided to stay in the United States. They did not want to leave. And in the darker areas, you have 50%, 60% of people voted not to leave the United States. They wanted to stay in the United States. But as you see, those areas were basically in North Texas along the Red River and in the hill country where basically there were a lot of German immigrants who were very loyal Unionists. So the war begins, and the war began in 1861 in April, not in Texas, but in South Carolina, when United States fort refused to surrender. The Confederates, South Carolina troops opened fire on the Fort Sumter, and that began the military operation of the Civil War. Initial beginning. So in the Civil War, probably 700,000 Texans fought for the Confederacy. After all, it was a southern state. The agriculture was one based on sugar plantations and cotton, both of which required slaves. And of course, slavery had been in Texas even before Texas joined in the United States. It had been, of course, part of Mexican Texas and the Republic of Texas as well. Now about maybe 2,000 to 3,000 other Texas men, they actually left the state and joined the Union Army. But most Texans fought for the Confederacy. Although most Texans did not actually leave Texas to fight. There were some Texas units that did fight, especially battles along the East Coast where most of the famous battles were. So Hood's Texas Brigade, which had about 4,400 troops in it, was one of the more famous Texas units, made up of all Texans. It was part of the Confederate Army in the East under the command eventually of Robert E. Lee. It fought in most of the major battles in the East Coast and fought very bravely. Having said that, of the 4,400 soldiers, 60% of them were killed or wounded during the war. Terry's Texas Rangers was a cavalry detachment as opposed to an infantry unit. They rode horses, and Terry's Texas Rangers were actually engaged in 275 battles during this 4-year war for the Confederacy, and they fought basically on this side of the Mississippi River for the Confederacy. So those are the two most famous units. And Ross's brigade, Saul Ross, would eventually become somewhat famous because he eventually becomes a governor of Texas. And of course, Saul Ross University, if you're ever in Alpine, Texas, out west, he's still famous out there. But really, the big units are Texas, the Hood Brigade or the Texas Brigade, a really celebrated unit in the Confederate Army. Texas was also known as the storehouse for the Confederacy, basically because goods were brought into and out of Texas by sea from Galveston and from Mexico across the border, and were then sent to other supplies in the Confederacy. A lot of our horses and supplies here in Texas were also sent to aid the Confederate Army. No major battles of the war took place here in Texas. So in the East, you had battles where you might have 30, 40, 50,000 men on either side fighting, very large-scale battles, but there were no major battles here in Texas. Most of the fighting centered on keeping the Gulf ports open. One of the Union strategies, one of the Northern strategies, one of the United States strategies to win the war was a blockade, basically to stop supplies by ship from coming to the Confederacy. The Union Navy would station warships off the coast of Confederate states and try to stop any ships coming into the Confederacy to bring supplies. So the Union blockade at first was not very successful in the war because at first the Union Navy only had something like maybe 90 warships, and most of those weren't active. But within just a couple of years, they had several hundred warships, and became much harder to bring things in and out of the Confederacy by sea. So there of course were some battles involving Texans that actually sort of weren't in Texas, but started from Texas, and one of those was the Battle of Gloriette Pass, when the Confederacy, using Texas troops, tried to take over New Mexico. So looking at this map, you can see the blue line started, the red line started here in Texas. General Silby, and his plan was not only to invade New Mexico, not only take over New Mexico, because New Mexico was not that important, but basically to eventually move into Colorado, where there was a gold strike going on, gold and silver strike. So they were planning on taking over all that gold and silver, but also the Confederacy was also planning on using Texas troops to move all the way to California and take over California and use those ports to bring things into and out of the Confederacy. So the invasion of New Mexico did not go very well for the Confederacy. They moved into New Mexico and ran into a strong Union fort, and they didn't have enough supplies to have a siege to take the fort, and they didn't have enough cannons to take the fort and capture the fort. So they basically just sort of left the fort there with Union troops in it and moved north. They got as far as northern New Mexico, as far as Glorietta Pass, and there they ran into another Union detachment. The Confederates actually did push the Union forces back at first, but then the Union forces basically destroyed all the Confederate wagons, which had basically the Confederate food and the Confederate ammunition. And the Confederates were then forced to retreat all the way back into Texas. So the Battle of Gloriette Pass was not a Confederate victory, it was a Union victory, and stopped the invasion of Colorado, and eventually, of course, stopped the invasion of California, since the Confederates never got that far. So the battles in Texas, starting off with the Battle of Galveston. So to make their blockade more effective, Union troops, the Union naval force off Galveston, which consisted of basically 5 warships and 2 gunboats, threatened to basically shell Galveston, threatened to basically use their cannons to blow up Galveston in late 1862. And so the Confederates left Galveston, and Union forces on their ships came into Galveston and took it over. But then in 1863, the Confederates in Texas had raised a larger army, and had also managed to build a few gunboats, and they retook Galveston in 1863. And in the process, they managed to capture about 400 U.S. Army troops. So the gunboats, by the way, the Confederates built, that they basically put cotton bales around the upper structure of the gunboat, and that way when Union cannonballs would hit the ship, they'd actually the cotton would absorb the energy of the cotton ball. The cotton would absorb the energy of the cannonball, which means the cannonball wouldn't actually get to hit the wooden structures of the ship, or at least if they did hit the wooden structures, they didn't make much of an impact. So these were called cottonclads by 1863, because by 1863, both the North and the South were using ironclads in the East, where they started making ships out of iron, which obviously prevented cannonballs from impacting your ships. But in Texas, we didn't have any ironclads, we just had cottonclads. which is sort of a cheap imitation. The other major battle, again, there's no major battles, but the only other semi-important battle of Texas was actually the Battle of Sabine Pass in 1863. And the Battle of Sabine Pass, if we can go to a map, I hope. So the Union forces, blockading forces, attempted to to sail their forces up the Sabine River. The Sabine River forms our eastern boundary with Louisiana. But they couldn't sail very far before they ran into a small Confederate fort. And small Confederate fort had like 47 guys in it and like 6 cannons. However, Big Dowling, who was in charge of the fort, had arranged to put some sort of logs in the water, some stakes in the water, wooden stakes in the water, and marked off the distances so the cannons know exactly how far to set their fuses to blow up the cannonball. So when the Union ships approached, the Confederate cannon fire was really accurate. And after losing a couple of ships, the Union forces simply turned back. And the Confederates didn't lose a man. And that stopped an invasion of Texas at that point. But then in 1864, just a year or so later, the Union tried to invade Texas again from the east. At Mansville, and this was a Confederate victory again. However, it was not really an invasion that the United States had put much effort into. It was part of a broader effort in 1864. The main effort was basically to take the Northern Army and take it from Washington, D.C. all the way down to the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia, and take Richmond, Virginia and seize the Confederate capital. And also, in order to do that, they wanted to make sure the Confederates could not get any reinforcements in the east. So the Union plan that year was basically to attack Confederates wherever they were in the Confederacy. The main goal in 1864 was to capture the Confederate capital in the east, but to do that, Union forces, wherever they were told to attack Confederates. And that way the Confederates would not have any extra troops to send to the east. And so Union forces in Louisiana attacked Confederate forces along the Sabine River, but the Confederates basically held them off because the Union Army, it was not really a serious attempt to attack into Texas. So the attack was repelled pretty quickly. So that brings us to, okay. So during this time, as the battles continued, many of our men, of course, in Texas were off fighting. So more work was left for those behind. And so especially on farms, if the men weren't there, that means the women and children were working a lot harder. So women started managing the farms and plantations. Of course, you know, our cowboys, they were off fighting. So the women actually drove cattle, and they worked in little, what called factories, small-scale factories in and around the Austin area. Meanwhile, there was an increase in the number of slaves in Texas simply because as Union forces invaded Confederate states, many of those plantation owners, instead of just letting their slaves be captured and get freedom, they sent their slaves to Texas. And those owners hoped that eventually the Confederacy would win the war and eventually they'd get their slaves back. Of course, too bad for them, ha ha ha, not really too bad for them, but they lost, of course, their slaves because eventually, of course, the Confederacy lost. So their little plan didn't work at all. And of course, I'm very sure that the slaves were very happy it didn't work at all. The blockade also reduced the sale of cotton because, again, not only could could the Confederates not get stuff in through their ports because there are Union ships, warships off the coast, like at Galveston? We couldn't send our cotton overseas, so basically there's no supplies coming in the Confederacy, and there's no money coming to the Confederacy because of the blockade. So many farmers here in Texas switched to growing food instead of growing cotton. Things like corn and wheat, things that the Confederacy could actually use to fight with, that is to feed their troops, and the troops could then fight, because obviously cotton would not be that helpful in a war, except maybe to make uniforms. So the blockade caused a shortage of almost all supplies. Anything that was brought in from overseas, it was really hard to get, and the prices rose dramatically. Okay. So here in Texas, tensions rose between the supporters of the Confederacy and the Union. When it came time for an actual vote of Texans to leave the Confederacy, about 1 in 4, about 25% of Texans were loyal to the United States still. Of course, the majority, 75% of Texans, at least white male voters in Texas, wanted to leave the United States and join the Confederacy, but about 25% of those white male voters wanted to stay in the United States. And so those people who wanted to stay, many of them did not support the Confederacy war effort. Even though Texas left the United States, at least they said they left the United States, about 25% of the population really tried not to take part in the war. And many of these were along the Red River in the north. And some of them were in the hill country in and around Austin, where there were, again, a lot of Germans. Meanwhile, Texans that were in favor of the Confederacy took it upon themselves to try to make sure that those people that were not fighting the Confederacy didn't cause problems. And one of the ways they made sure Unionists here in Texas didn't cause problems was simply to kill them. So vigilantes, people acting technically without any law on their side, hung at least 40 Unionists in Gainesville in 1862. And there were many other hangings in Texas, and just executions in Texas of Unionists that actually were never recorded here in Texas. Meanwhile, many of the Germans in central Texas didn't want to take part in the war, and they certainly did not want to be made to join the Confederate Army, and so some of them tried to leave Texas. The Confederate Army here in Texas, basically the Texas militia, then found these about 60 or so Germans that were trying to leave Texas, and they surrounded them and basically conducted a surprise attack against them. And of the 60, 16 of them were killed outright, and 9 of them were wounded in that surprise attack. The rest of the Germans at the time then surrendered. Later that evening, the 9 wounded were taken out and simply shot by the Confederate forces here in Texas, sometimes called a massacre. Massacre at the Neches River, in fact. So there were tensions in Texas, and in fact in every southern state. There were generally groups, sometimes very large groups, that had never wanted to leave the United States. And in many southern states, there was sort of this infighting between the Confederate groups and the Unionist groups. And that was certainly true in Texas as well. The Union, the United States, did manage to capture the capital city of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. The Confederate Army under General Robert E. Lee then tried to retreat and continue fighting, but a large United States Army under Ulysses S. Grant surrounded them in Virginia and at the town of Appomattox Courthouse. And by the way, it's not a courthouse, it's not a building, it's the name of the town. At Appomattox Courthouse, Lee, in command of the biggest, best army of the Confederacy, surrendered to General Grant on April 9th, 1865. That news, however, took time to reach Texas. So as other Confederate generals heard that the biggest and best Union army surrendered, and by the way, the biggest and best Confederate army surrendered, and by the way, the biggest and best Confederate army, at that point, at least one out of every two of them didn't have any shoes. Many of them had like little no ammunition left for their guns. And that was the best equipped Confederate Army, General Lee's Confederate Army. So most of the other Confederate armies were even in worse shape. So when many of these other Confederate armies heard that General Lee surrendered, they also surrendered. However, down near Brownsville, at Palmetto Ranch, news had leaked out that General Lee had surrendered to General Grant. Union troops landed at Brownsville, then started to make their way along the Rio Grande River. However, there's at least one Confederate commander who wasn't ready to give up yet. He claimed he never heard that Lee surrendered to Grant, and that's probably not true. But nevertheless, when Union troops were making their way up, following the Rio Grande River, they were attacked by about 300 of these Confederates, led by this sort of renegade commander. And basically, the Union guys didn't stick around very long. Several hundred of them just gave up, and the others sort of retreated very quickly because they recognized the war's over, and why do you want to fight and die when the war's over? Shortly after the battle, the Union officers and some local townspeople rode out to where these Confederates were still there and said, hey, look, the war's really over, and you guys should give up, and at which point they did. And most historians consider this probably the last major battle of the war. The last battle of the war. It wasn't a major battle. There were only a couple hundred people involved. So that marks the end of the Civil War here in Texas.